Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Nonviolence International's YouTube channel. My name is Nimesh, and in this latest installment of the Spotlight series, I have the great privilege of speaking with YaliniDream. YaliniDream is a Sri Lankan Tamil artist, writer, dancer, and futurist. Manchester-born, Texas-bred, and Brooklyn-brewed, YaliniDream conjures spirit through her unique blend of poetry, theater, song, and dance, reshaping reality and seeking peace through justice in the lands of earth, psyche, soul, and dream. She has toured nationally throughout the US, as well as performing in Canada, Europe, and Sri Lanka. She has performed from renowned venues such as Dance Theater Workshop and the Lincoln Center to subway cars and street protests. YaliniDream has over 20 years experience as a cultural worker, consultant, and organizer in anti-war, anti-violence, and racial, gender, and economic justice movements. Yalini, thank you so much for being here with me today.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me to this space and for this conversation.
You've worked in solidarity with war-impacted and persecuted communities in the north and east of Sri Lanka. And when I read your bio on the War Resisters League website, it says that it describes you taking the difficult position of questioning all armed actors and ethno-nationalisms in order to cultivate a people-centered, pluralistic, anti-caste, feminist vision of Tamil liberation. There's so much to unpack there. First off, can you describe the solidarity work you've done for these communities in Sri Lanka and what that experience was like and how it's impacted you?
Sure. So I was born outside of the island, and I have family that lived and is living in the north and east. I was in Sri Lanka as a child, and then after the war began, I was unable to return to where my family is until the war ended. And so I grew up with the backdrop of the war. I grew up knowing that our family members, people that I loved, people that I knew as a child, were under threat. And also grew up with our family members and loved ones escaping the region, also through asylum, and coming, us meeting finally and hearing about what it is that they went through. My father also survived one of the massacres in the late 50s, and so was a child during that time. And so I also was raised with those stories of massacre and gatherings being tear gassed, and the targeting of our communities by the police and the army, and then the need for Tamil self-determination and sovereignty and self-defense. So in many ways, because my personal family stories were of the violence that the Sri Lankan state had done to our family. I also had an auntie an uncle and cousins who escaped the 83 massacre, a cousin that was shot by the Sri Lankan army at a very young age. My father survived and witnessed unspeakable things. And so my politic was shaped and easily directed into a Tamil ethno-nationalist politic. I adopted at a very young age the idea that Tamil freedom was by having our own country, or that we needed to at least have self-governance separate of the Sri Lankan state. That politics shifted for multiple reasons. I think if we listen to scholars and organizers and activists from the African continent, they have analysis around secession and the division of small regions into non-cooperative nations, and as a right-wing project and something that doesn't always serve the people. I think my analysis around how borders actually can militarize borders that require passports in order to be able to move from one area to another can actually limit the mobility and safety of a community. And then, but more than these other political analysis from other regions, I began to meet other Tamil people who had different experiences than me. And I wanted to listen and learn and understand the context in a broader way. And when I think things became much more impassioned for me was, even though I couldn't return to where my family was living because of the war and because of the extreme acts of violence and war crimes and the shellings and the danger that it was to be able to travel alone to where my family was from while the war was happening, I chose to volunteer in the refugee camps in South India where our peoples were fleeing. I was like, if I can't go home, then at least let me go to where our peoples are fleeing to. And there I heard so many different stories, and the stories were nuanced and they were complex. And there were many people who absolutely wanted to be able to have mobility throughout the island. There were folks who were critical of all armed actors who had been contending with multiple forces of violence, from the state to the street, within their homes, who were contending with militant groups, paramilitary groups, underground economy, like, all sorts of different forces of violence that people were contending with. And I started to understand that for especially many Tamil women and youth, it was multiple forces of violence that people were contending with, multiple armed actors, and a very complex myriad of violence that people were having to navigate. And out of my heart and love commitment of wanting all Tamil peoples to be able to experience freedom and liberation, my politic really shifted. Also, as a queer person, in solidarity with queer and trans folks, with sex workers, there were ways in which the LTTE, which is the rebel group that claimed to be the sole representation of Tamil people, were also targeting and executing and participating in patriarchal policing of our communities, that was targeting, trans women who were not demonstrating and dedicated to the Tamil cause, as well as sex workers. Now, it's a complex context in which that emerged. There were ways in which the Sri Lankan state was trying to pull Tamils away from militancy through porn and sexual distraction and and other forms of cultural infiltration, and there was a retaliation against that through this strict patriarchal policing, um, and violence is violence, atrocity is atrocity. For people who are dealing with their loved ones who are being killed, that grief is extreme. And so I started to question what could a deeper vision of liberation look like that accounted for the multiple stories within our communities, and why is it that only certain stories are amplified or even allowed to be told. And I recognize myself actually as someone from a family whose stories were affirmed by the dominant discourse. And I felt like there was a need for me to step into deeper solidarity with folks whose stories were not heard. And I felt like we could have a deeper vision of liberation for our people that was beyond ethno-nationalism, that recognized the multiple forms of violence within our communities, including casteism, including misogyny, including, as well as the state and police violence that our communities were facing, and recognizing that in some ways, according to if we're in a conversation with other revolutionary struggles throughout the world, people are starting to question whether ethno-nationalism and these separate states are actually participating in the colonial white supremacist project, and whether we need to reorient how humanity is organized, and that, dividing peoples based on their language, ethnicity, creating militarized borders, is that something that is actually moving us towards greater peace and prosperity, or is it something that is continuing to serve a paradigm of exploitation and domination and division amongst humanity? Love and integrity is the foundation of my politics, and I felt like my politics was not expansive enough to recognize the multiple truths within our communities. And so I became critical of multiple armed actors based on the stories that I was hearing from people who were living through the war in the North and East. And that was very unpopular at the time. Really, my intention was to question what could liberation look like for our peoples, and can we take this vision further?
It's really interesting to hear your shift away from ethno-nationalism. I think I've been thinking about it in the context of Israel-Palestine. My org, Nonviolence International, we do a lot of work to support Palestinian activist groups, and one of our co-founders wrote a book called Beyond the Two-State Solution, questioning both Zionism and Palestinian nationalism, and arguing for a one-state solution. So I think there are a lot of interesting parallels between those two examples. I want to talk about nonviolence. I mean, you talked about the armed actors already, but I think one of the critiques that I've encountered of nonviolence is that marginalized groups and oppressed groups have the right to use violence to fight against oppression, right? So as someone who believes in revolutionary nonviolence, I guess, how would you respond to that argument?
I think I became so disillusioned and heartbroken over the LTTE, and I felt like it was liberation gone wrong, and it engaged in authoritarian practices that was not serving our peoples, and in the end did not move our peoples towards greater freedom. And so there was a period that where I was anti all armed struggle, because I felt so disillusioned and heartbroken. I think the Haitian Revolution really pulled me into greater nuance. And I also, I think that there is a way in which there's a polarization of armed self-defense and revolutionary nonviolence that actually often serves white supremacists as well as other supremacist politics and domination and control. I think we need to look at the reality of the violence that a community is enduring, and think through how do we defend ourselves against acts of genocide? What is the pathway to liberation in the face of great violence? Learning through my friends and from history about the Haitian Revolution helped me hold true to the desire to bring forth revolutionary change without ever taking a life, while also recognizing that my life was worth protecting. We have to sit in that complexity and nuance about what self-defense looks like for a community, and what the specificities of that violence is, and how do we hold on to principles and values when defending ourselves against great violence. I think that even when we start to look at abolition and transformative justice movements, and when we, I was part of a group called Safe Outside the System Collective, which provided alternatives for policing, or gave an how do we address transphobic and homophobic violence against communities without relying on the police. And the idea was, let's build an alternative for people who can't call the police, but we never told people don't, because until we've built the connective tissue that supports people in being able to defend themselves, to be able to navigate violence that they are navigating, we're in this contradictory place. Right. So I think we have to be really careful about being purist. For me, I believe in certain contexts that actually revolutionary nonviolence is tactically and strategically more effective. Right. Especially when folks are less resourced. The war in Illankai took part in the north and east, right? The lands that were shelled were the lands of Tamil peoples, right? So often it is the people who are being persecuted and targeted and people who are poor and people who have less access to resources. It is their lands on which the wars are waged. And so we need to keep that in mind when we think about what it means for us to wage peace. Perhaps I am a little bit of a contradiction as someone who deeply believes in revolutionary nonviolence, who trains in it, who puts my energy towards a path of liberation, who would like to live a life where I am able to move towards liberation without taking another life. And at the same time, I think that we have to sometimes align with armed self-defense. So with my friends, I sometimes joke I'm a pro-Dessalines, revolutionary nonviolent. organizer, because when we look at the conditions that Haiti was under with Napoleon and Rochambeau, and the extreme violence and acts of genocide, and the ways in which people were being murderously, you know, I mean, enslaved in some of the worst conditions, and were able to unite across tribes and across languages and in such intense conditions, and be able to rise up and defeat Napoleonic France. Like I think even within that revolution, there was an alignment between revolutionary nonviolent tactics and armed self-defense. And so I think we have to look. There's a sticky, nuanced place there where we have to subvert the polarization that says that Dr. King is in opposition to Malcolm X, or that Louverture is in opposition to Dessalines, or even Empress Félicité is in. Empress Félicité was married to Dessalines, right? But she was anchored in what I would interpret as revolutionary nonviolent tactics. So I think we have to be able to swim through the nuance.
We've talked about a little bit the war in Sri Lanka. The war lasted like 30 years and is, technically over, and yet the trauma and the wounds of that conflict still persist. And when I was doing research for this interview, I found an interview of yours from 2014, and you said, "We haven't reached a just peace in Sri Lanka." And I think even in 2022, we still haven't reached a just peace. So in your mind, what would a just peace look like?
I believe that a just peace allows for all persecuted communities on the island to be able to live with dignity and safety, and be able to move towards their desires and aspirations, to be able to dream for future generations. It will require fundamental systems change that's beyond the island. There are economic conditions that are also contributing to the exploitation and violence that people are enduring. Klinochi is the poorest district on the island, and is also contending with the forces of climate change, of neoliberalism, as well as policies that do not recognize the full dignity of the people of that region. It is a fertile region that was once famous for the food that was able to be cultivated in that area. Our current, economies do not uplift the work or support the work of those who grow our food, and do not provide multiple forms of economic sovereignty for people in rural areas. And I think peace must be waged. It's not something that comes easily. Often our most exploited, targeted, persecuted communities are having to be in constant rapid response mode, having to deal with the violence at hand. There's very little time for the replenishment and nourishment. I mean, people do it. People are constantly healing. And, when you're in conditions of great violence, healing is breath, right? Like every part of your life is, learning to contend with conditions that are set up against your existence. And so in order to exist, people develop incredible skills for survival. I would love for our communities to be able to move beyond surviving towards thriving. And the conditions that allow for that, that allow for the most persecuted in our communities to be able to move towards thriving, are the conditions that are necessary for a just peace.
That is a great place to end our interview. Thank you so much. You've given me so many things to process and think about in the coming days and weeks and months. Thank you for sharing your time with me today.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you.
If you think these conversations are important and would like to see them continue, please consider supporting NVI and the work we do by subscribing to this YouTube channel, following us on Twitter and Facebook, and visiting our website. Also, please consider donating to our organization. Every little bit counts to help build a more just and nonviolent world.